All right, so the way this is going to work, inshallah, again, we're going to try to engage the audience, but there are some things I want to tie the day together, and I'm going to sort of pose some questions to our ulama here. Before I do so, I want to share with you a snippet of an educational enterprise. This will be interesting for, I think, the ulama and for us to hear of an educational event in the Muslim community talking about organ donation and brain death, okay? So I want you to hear the snippet, given all that you've heard today, and I'm not going to comment on it, I just want you to hear it. And then that's going to give you some fodder to think about how the questions I ask you to address are framed. After that, you'll have 10 minutes each to talk about those questions or anything else I misrepresented. And then it will be for you guys to have a field day with them, inshallah. So let's see, Rosie's going to get that clip.
Sure, this is going to work. I don't know if the audio is hooked up, but let me give it a try.
You have the mic right there.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'll do.
Again, it is irreversible loss of all functions, vital functions of the brain. Okay,
All right, so now we got to work.
That a little deeper. The neurological criteria for death. Again, it is irreversible loss of all functions, vital functions of the brain. Okay? But brain death is not a vegetative state. Okay? Now, the neurological criteria for death. Again, it is irreversible loss of all functions, vital functions of the brain. Okay? But brain death is now, the reason that this is important to talk about is because an individual must meet this neurologic criteria to be an organ donor. But every year, only a very small percentage of people, which is about 2-3%, will die from this type of brain injury, okay? So if someone has battled a long, brave fight with cancer in his or her 80s, not a candidate for organ donation. Someone with HIV or Hep C, not a candidate for organ donation. Lots of other comorbidity factors and lots of other reasons most people cannot be organ donors. It's the individuals that have brain death that have had such traumatic injury to the brain. This picture you're looking at here helps when we're having discussions oftentimes with families in the hospital to explain to them this brain death and what has happened to their loved one. So you'll see on the left, that's a skull, brain inside of the skull. And you can see the left, from the brain stem all the way up, you have healthy blood flow. You have oxygenated blood. The heart is pumping the blood is going up to the brain, doing its thing, feeding the brain is alive, okay? On the right, you will see there's no blood getting up into the brain, meaning no oxygen to the brain, no oxygenated blood. The heart is still pumping at this point because the person is on a ventilator, but the brain has died.
So yeah, the person used that slide, and you see, right, that slide there, what she was referring to, mentioning no blood flow. Anyway, so we'll move on, but that's the context of how education is being delivered at this point to our communities. So the questions are, all right. So here are the questions, discussion points for you, Shaykh Amin and Shaykh Rafaqat, at the intersection of brain death and organ donation. So is donation after declaration of brain death living or deceased donation in your view? If living, then how do we assure consent? If it's dead, then should prior wishes of the person be actionable or not? The second question is, who has decisional authority over the disposition of brain-dead individuals? Is it the family? Is it the state? What authority? And then, what harms can be tolerated when procuring organs from a brain-dead individual? Right? Oftentimes, to prepare a donor, there are medications that must be delivered and given. would those medications that are classically of no quote-unquote benefit to the person in that state, but might help sustain the organs or make them more viable for transplantation, be things that we are permitted to do, or are they considered harms that are accrued? So those are the questions I'd like you to talk about or think about and discuss with us before we open up to the audience. Jazakallah khair.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Okay, right, now. The discussion regarding brain death. What I want to do, because this is a really complex subject, and the further you go into the subject, you realize the level of complexity. I was involved in a meeting or a seminar organized by the National Health Service in the UK, and we had a couple of ulama there from many different backgrounds, and these are quite influential ulama, so a lot of them were muftis who are basically going to be passing verdicts on the issue of organ transplantation and all related areas. And we had some neuroscientists as well who were sat there for them to prod and get some answers. One of the things that actually happened at the end of this meeting, which was about 8 hours, or the seminar, was a lot of those ulama approached me. I said, can you explain what they said? It just goes to show the level of complexity that arises in this particular discussion. Now, from my work and the sort of the area that I've been looking into, and I've looked into quite a bit of from death, from the Islamic viewpoint, I've looked at it from theology, kalam. I've also looked at it from philosophy, and also, so that's sort of current philosophical discussions related to this. Having discussed this with also neuroscientists, I'm just going to read out my conclusion. If I was to say this in my words without reading this, I'd probably be doing some element of injustice to this. So I'm going to give you my perspective. This is my own personal opinion, okay? And I want to read out my conclusion from this. There's a lot more detail behind this, but for those of you who were here yesterday, you probably get more of an idea about my conclusion anyway. But generally speaking, if I read it out, it'll make more sense. Okay, so I will elaborate on certain points within the conclusion. Okay, so death is a process, and it has generally been viewed by many as an event. So this latter view is the more traditional one and deeply embedded in society through the arts, literature, and law. To escape from such a conception of death can prove difficult and arouse moral sensibilities. Once the death cascade has been initiated, shortly after, external physical signs manifest and can be detected through observation or clinical tests. With the medical technology that we have today, this process can be prolonged and delayed through the support of artificial means and even reversed. The capacity for self-consciousness, and this is the idea of sentience and volition, which would be considered as a higher brain functioning, and not merely consciousness, is a precondition for virtually everything that is, sorry, lost my pace here. Virtually everything that we value in our lives and in our purpose as moral agents. A continued life as a person is an essential property for our existence in our bodies. We have little or no stake in continuing when we permanently lose our self-consciousness. The soul has no purpose in remaining embodied. If the body dies, it will be at no loss to the soul if it has no essential control or capacity for self-consciousness. It is problematic to suggest that the difference between human life and death comes down to the state of two organs, the heart and the lungs. Heart and lungs can be artificially replaced as the organism maintains integrated functioning. The traditional approach, which is the approach where we, classically it's been recorded in the books of fiqh, as in the science that Dr. Aasim presented earlier on, and also, more so, the approach where you are going by the pulse and the breathing. The traditional approach overemphasizes our biological nature, suggesting we are nothing more than organisms. A cardiopulmonary death conception leaves the whole idea of the soul departing from the body, which is supported through scripture and Muslim scholarly authority as a redundant notion. The soul leaves the body during the death process when the capacity for self-consciousness of life has permanently ceased. So as has been advocated by Muslim theologians and jurists, and I make reference to one of the points that Dr. Aasim put up earlier on, where jurists talk about death in two forms, okay? They talk about what we call maut al-haqiqi and maut al-hukmi. And maut al-hukmi, I'll give you just one example what maut al-hukmi is. So if an individual has gone away, and he has a family, he's married and so forth, and then he doesn't return for many years, and there is a high probability that he's died, then there are many issues that arise in terms of his current marriage contract with his wife and so forth. His wife wants to marry again, maybe, or so, there are other issues of inheritance. Okay, so on that basis, the ulama may make a decision that will be considered as death. We'll take this hukm, the ruling of death. So it's not death in reality, but it will be considered as death on the basis of a generalized opinion by the scholars. And that is what we call death, maut al-haqiqi. And maut al-haqiqi would be considered more so as where every single cell of the body has died. Okay? Now I want you to think about that. Every single cell of the body has died. When do we know that's going to happen? So on that basis, it is during this process that we must determine what behaviors are appropriate and at what time. So if you look at it from that particular perspective, the first is on the basis of speculation, which is highly probable. So when the consciousness or the sentience and the volition together have gone in an individual, and this is a permanent capacity of the living of this of the existence of this sentience and volition has diminished or gone, it ceased. At that point, the ruling of maut al-hukmi can be applied. Whereas to then finally bury, you would need to wait for a stage where the body has died itself, the physical, the biological body has died. Okay? So you couldn't, in essence, argue the case where, well, in that case, the person has died, so the person is the volition, the sentience, and so forth. That person has died, but the body is still alive. So even though the body is, you're using artificial means, you would take off that support because you're just prolonging the process of death. So I'll just finally finish off on a few things, which get a bit technical, but I'm not going to make a mention of them. So I'm just going to finish off with this last paragraph. So the boundary between life and death is not perfectly sharp. Perhaps death is no more determinate than our transition from childhood to adulthood. So a transition which must persuade us that it is death itself, not dying. So you can't end up saying things like, grandmother is partly dead, but less dead than grandfather, although he's not fully dead. So in any standard of death adopted, there will always be the possibility of misdiagnosis. What is ultimately important is public acceptance of when death behaviors can occur. And the important thing to also understand here is that there are practical implications of you considering a person having died when there is biological death of the whole body. And those practical implications are, to be honest, such that if we are going to be consistent with that idea, you would have to keep somebody on life support for as long as possible. And there could be an argument also that why not keep everybody on a life support? So it's important to note here, so my take on this is when the person has died, and the person is in relation to the volition and sentience and all the sort of complex understandings around the idea of the philosophy of the mind, when that has ceased and the capacity for that has ceased, then that would be considered as death. And at that time, you can now enact all the death behaviors.
I don't know about you guys, but I'm already brain dead. MashaAllah. Jazakumullah khair. It's the end of the day, and everybody's tired, and MashaAllah. Just a couple of things I would like to add to Maulana's presentation. One issue he raises, the issue of perception, which allows you to have volition. We've discussed this before in our workshops, and the Islamic ruling on someone who is unconscious but yet alive is that there's still some benefit to that person living, even though he may not have volition. Okay? So that does come in books of fiqh, where if somebody is unconscious, hypothetically, it may never happen, but if someone was unconscious and you took him to Arafat on the 9th of Dhul Hajj, he would be a Haji. So he will get the reward of the Hajj. So even though the taklif is not there, the reward is there. So there is some benefit to assuming that there is life, or some benefit to prolonging life, so that the Muslim is rewarded for living. So there's a reward for staying alive, and there's a reward for being sick also. So I think you may want to include that in the discussion or in the equation before you determine someone has died. And that doesn't answer any of Dr. Aasim's questions, and we're trying to avoid the questions, both of us, because we are not advocates of organ transplantation anyway. But having said that, someone who's declared brain dead would be Islamically alive until proven otherwise. And if anybody was to do a transplant of his or her organs at that time, it will be a live transplant. The issue then is consent. So then consent will be of two types. One is through the Islamic norms or means, and the other is through the non-Islamic norms and means. Non-Islamic norms and means in this country, I would assume, would be through the power of attorney or something like that. Okay? Then that's how you would get consent. And through the Islamic norms and means, you wouldn't have any viable ability to receive consent. So we will still be left in some kind of conundrum there as far as Islamic law goes. And I think that will be the end of my observations on this issue, unless you have more questions.
So, Shaykh, I mean, when you were saying it's an issue of consent, the person is still living even though they're brain dead, but they wouldn't be able to consent to suicide or something, or like removing organs when they're still alive. So how does that work? How are you saying?
I'm saying that the default position would be the law of the land. Because if the law of the land allows such a consent, then you could fall back on that if there was a case for darura, right? Now, it was all hypothetical in my mind. Yeah. But you're right, that that person would not be able to give consent unless there was a power of attorney prior to that. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. If a person who's brain dead, his organs are given up for a transplantation, his heart and his brain for whatever purpose, like for research, right, concussion studies and so on, and then he's put in the grave, how does the angels come in and how does the soul come back in the grave when he's got no organs?
How does the soul come back?
Oh, in the grave, what, I mean, there's supposed to be angels coming, asking questions in the grave.
It's a different world altogether. The world of graves is part of what we call the barzakh. So when someone dies, they're transported to the barzakh. It's called the world which is a barrier between this world and the hereafter. That's the general domain. the person returns to the grave site only when the body is buried. So when the body is buried, the soul returns somewhere there. There's a connection there, albeit a very slim one. But the barzakh is still there. You're already in the barzakh as soon as you die. But the grave is part of the barzakh. So it's a small space in the barzakh where your body is buried and the soul returns to the body. But it's still in the barzakh even before the body is buried. So, you know, if that answers your question, I don't know. Yeah.
I remember being asked this question, but quite differently. There is a prophetic tradition related to something similar, which gives us a bit of an idea around this. Shaykh Amin, what he's talked about is completely correct. There's a metaphysical world out there, which is the period of barzakh, which is something which is ghaib, you know, is something unseen. We don't know, we don't understand it. But just to highlight that particular question, the prophetic tradition goes on the lines of the fact that there was, and this is my own words, there was a particular individual who feared God. And his fear was that when I basically go to God and I will be in this sinful state. So out of that fear, he basically wanted his body to be put in ashes and spread all over the world. Okay? Now, on that individual, that particular hadith suggests that all those pieces put together, and he was then brought before God. Okay? So if you're talking about the idea of somebody without an organ or somebody else's organ, yeah, it's we can't explain it from the sort of logical perspective that we see the world in today. It's a very different dimension, and it has a different kind of an explanation. But the main point to suggest, and this is something that goes into the issue of kalam, Imam Ghazali argues the issue that does it have to be the same mithal, the same body, for you to be resurrected? And the argument to that is, no, it doesn't have to be the same body, it's just a mithal, and the like of that body. So there's a big debate in the kalam end of this whole debate, okay? So you'd have to prod into that particular detail to get more detail.
Assalamu alaikum, jazakallah khair. So I'm just going to state how I understood it. So based on the previous discussions, what I took away was donating organs after death is not permissible. However,
From me?
I took that from both of you, and maybe I took it wrong. No. Oh, see, thank you. Okay, for clarifying.
Can I clarify that position?
Please,
I think people
that would be
understand it.
fantastic.
Yeah? Okay. Yeah. If you look at my article, it'll explain in more detail. The point that I'm raising is the issue of objectification. Okay? I'm giving you an understanding of why Hanafi scholars, which tend to be majority of the South Asian scholars, okay, they basically have a real issue with the idea of organ donation in the dead. Okay? And the reason why they do that is because they say there's this element of objectification here. And I've explained why. Right. Now, I've also explained that when you look at the whole literature, and this also applies to the Hanafi school, if that organ is used for the same purpose, okay, and when I talk about purpose, it means within the same jins, with the same genus, i.e. with the same kind of idea to be used for a similar kind of purpose. On that basis, it would be permissible. That's what I'm saying, okay?
I heard that being before death.
Yeah.
But it was different after.
But the point that I was raising, which is what Shaykh Amin mentioned, is that this is solely out of necessity, yeah? On that basis that we should not be content with this idea. So the question to you is, from my perspective, if you were to ask me, can I carry, this will be more to the point, can I carry a donor card? My answer to that is, yes, you can carry a donor card. But I would suggest that you're specific about which organs you want to donate, okay? And that requires a bit of work in terms of what organs you can donate, okay? Also, you need to be very clear about it, and the donor card does demonstrate that you are clear about it. You've given your consent to that as well, okay? However, on the bigger picture, there needs to be quite a bit of work that recognizes that there is a serious need out there for this, yeah? Now, if that need is met, then the whole concept of dhurura and necessity is no longer. Which means that you no longer can apply the idea of necessity anymore. So let's say, for example, there is this thing about compatibility. Now, from my understanding, having talked to renal transplantation surgeons and people within that profession, is that there's this incompatibility that exists between South Asians, okay, and Caucasians. Yeah? And basically, the life of this kidney that has been transplanted is less likely to be as prolonged in terms of its prognostic survival relative to one if it was done by, let's say, somebody who's related to you or somebody from the same ethnic background. So on that basis, it's not a racial thing that I'm talking about. It's solely on the basis that I'm saying what is going to give us a definitive prognosis. Yeah? So on that basis, let's say we've achieved such a situation that virtually the whole problem of the deficit that we have in organ donations has been dealt with. At that point, it no longer becomes necessary, and then it will be prohibited. Okay? So you need to ensure the miqdar or the qadr in terms of the level at which you can apply that ruling. Necessity has some stringent conditions, right? One of the conditions is that you are not content. You must work to ensure that that same status quo does not exist. So it's for specifically more so, it's not just the Muslim community, there's other faith groups as well. There's Jews and there are Christians that I've talked to as well, where, you know, and other people who have an issue with this, and also scientists, they need to work towards another solution. Yeah? Somebody was talking about cloning organs and various other things. We need to work towards another solution. Okay, we should not just sit there and think, oh, organ donation is cheaper, and people keep banging on about this idea, it's cheaper, okay? Yeah, it produces excellent results, we accept that. But on the bit where I'm sort of just addressing Shaykh Amin's issue is that we can't sit here and wait, okay? There are people out there who are dying, yeah? So we can't sit here and wait. So at the moment, we should donate our organs, yeah, to sort out this issue. But once that issue has been sorted, and we've reached a level where we are quite content now that this issue of necessity has been dealt with, then it's prohibited.
That was my other part, was the necessity piece. And you
I just want to, I know I meant to say this earlier, because of the point that you just raised, Shaykh Rafaqat. So, you know, oftentimes, again, thinking about the Muslim community in education efforts, there have been a lot of efforts to try to ally religious perspectives and how can we, the questions asked and framed, how can we get Muslims to want to donate their organs? But the question that isn't asked is how can we get Muslims to work with us so that we prevent organ failure? Right?
Yeah.
Right? So this, I mean, you understand that we want to use the religious armamentarium to try to construct an argument to help for organ donation to exist, but we forget, well, how don't we band together to prevent organ failure in the beginning?
Yeah.
And so I think that's another way to say the same thing, right? That we're trying to react as opposed to be proactive in the entire discussion.
Assalamualaikum, that was excellent. Just a quick question for Dr. Rafaqat. Shaykh Amin, he responded to the first question that it would be considered a living transplant for brain death. Would you agree with that, given your criteria?
A living transplant?
Yeah. You would agree?
Sorry, I don't
So
fully
the
understand
question, the first controversy,
Yeah.
was when a body is considered brain dead.
Okay.
Yeah.
So having read my conclusion, my sort of grasp on this is what we consider as, for those of you who understand the different types of standards that are used for death at the present moment. There is the traditional, okay, and then there's the brain death as we see it. That's the whole brain death. In the UK, it's the brainstem death, and there's reasons why the brainstem death is being put forward. And I find the whole idea of total brain death just useless. It's being used in the USA, but it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
To me, it doesn't mean anything, because I've read into the philosophy of this whole idea. But brainstem death is the essence of what you're really referring to. And then you have what we call the higher brain death, okay, which is basically to do with, that term is not really generally used, but the higher brain functioning, okay? And that is the loss, and I will use this in a broad sense, not being very careful about the words I use, because those words don't really reflect what I mean, okay? Sentience, volition, I'm just using them for the moment, okay? But those concepts will be suggestive of higher brain functioning. When that has failed, then to that degree, then I would say that that individual has now reached a stage which we'll call mawt al-hukmi, okay? And at that point, death behaviors can now be initiated.
So what are we meant to do? Because one Sheikh Amin is saying that he would consider that a living donation,
Yeah.
and you would consider it maut hukmi, a deceased donation.
Fiqh or fatwa is not basically legally binding. You need to basically make a decision of your own. You need to decide which opinion you would want to go with. And that opinion has to be such that you trust the opinion of that individual, not on the basis that you feel that he's more lenient or he's more conservative. You need to make that decision.
Do you think we'll ever have consensus of the ulama?
Sorry?
Consensus of the ulama.
You will never have consensus.
But can I just add one thing, and this is really important, and I think people sometimes misunderstand diversity, and they see that as a problem. Now, consensus of ulama is something that is important, and I don't deny that. And that is when ulama come together, okay, and they all sort of really trash it out. And I think this is something that ulama should do. I don't think there's enough of this happening, where ulama, this is something that you can't have lay people in there. It has to be ulama, okay? They've been informed, they've been given all the detail that they've been given, and it has to be, representative groups. They have to all sit together and really trust this out with the usul, with the furu, and everything put together, and really have a deep discussion at the end of this. But at the end of it, what will happen is, let's say 70 to 80% would agree with opinion A, whereas the other group will agree with opinion B. Now, the problems that arise with some of these fiqh academies is that there is a conclusion, and that conclusion just states that this is what we've come to as our final agreement. And then when it goes out into the communities, that minority, which clearly have disagreed, they're not convinced. They'll go out and they'll tell their followers that this is my opinion. And that's where the issue generally tends to arise. So, but that element of diversity is a sense of blessing in one case, okay? And that is the fact that you need that spectrum of diversity. If you read philosophy on the issue of brain death, they are just as diverse in their opinions as ulama. They really have a go at each other. That, and just recently, there's a bit of a trend going back to the traditional understanding of death. Yeah, and there's been some recent journal articles that are suggesting that some of the philosophers are going back to the traditional understanding. So, that diversity is a positive thing, not a negative thing. But then what it does is you need to make a decision. You need to decide whose opinion you trust, okay? Who's done detailed research, has a good understanding, and follow their opinion.
Jazakallah khair. Can I ask Sheikh Amin what you would define for deceased donation then, the criteria of death that you would use for deceased?
You'd have to consider all possible criteria. Okay? It'd be the whole thing. You're going to declare not just the body dead, but the whole person and being as dead. If you agree with the Shaykh's premise that death is a process. Okay? If death is a process, then your definition of death must be comprehensive. It can't be based on one criteria. It must be based on every criteria. That's when it becomes a process. Okay. Just on the issue, is that okay? Yeah.
The problem with that definition is that it doesn't assist with transplantation, because when the body is fully deceased, that does not provide good environment for the organs to be, harvested. There are better optimal.
That's the problem of those who want to believe in organ transplants. It's not my problem. That's your problem, whoever it is. Inshallah. But what I'm saying to follow up with the diversity issue is that, in this country at the highest level of judiciary matters, Supreme Court, you're going to have a 5-4 split, right? So even though there's a 5-4, meaning 4 judges are disagreeing with the other 5, but the other 4 still need to write their dissent. So that it's documented. And that's the beauty of understanding inconclusive issues. We disagree where there is no conclusive evidence that tells us this is the murad of Allah, this is the intent of God about these issues. And there we have the role of a jurist, of ijtihad, of diverse opinions, and I think that's very healthy, and it's a luxury that the Muslim Ummah used to enjoy in our great civilization. We don't anymore. We don't enjoy this prerogative of diversity of opinion, but we should. We should celebrate it.
So I had a question relating to the fact that when you have a donor card, you should be careful of what organs you place on that card. So can you elaborate on that in terms of like the main organs like heart, lung, pancreas, liver, kidney?
Donor card is different here. So the donor card. So I didn't mean to take the mic away from you, but and I'll give it back to you. But I wanted to suggest that we, from my perspective, what he was suggesting is that we have a form that delineates what sorts of organs, under what conditions we're willing to donate. I don't think he meant donor card. The donor card here almost gives carte blanche for those who believe they have authority over the government, basically, to take organs, and then it's even family cannot overrule that. So it becomes quite problematic in the United States context. So I think what he was saying was about more of like a form, but you can clarify if you meant something else.
So it was more on the lines of what organs can we donate? Are there any exceptions?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, the donor cards in the UK are quite, I assume they were the same, but they are quite different. In the UK, it's much more specific. It clearly highlights which organs you're willing to donate. And you have a list of a menu of which particular organs you wish to donate. Yeah, so it's quite different. So that needs to be corrected. Yeah.
Her question is which organs can, like for example, can you elaborate about the lung and about the heart and about the pancreas and about the eyes? Which ones, like, what are the considerations to take into account?
So kidneys was an example. Yeah. And if you look at the liver, the thing with liver is that we already recognize that if somebody loses their liver, then clearly that's much more of a greater acute threat. So on that basis. But I can't elaborate on those answers right now. I'd have to look back and sort of look at the whole bigger picture in terms of which organs they would be. But generally speaking, the conventional common ones are the kidney and even the heart. Yeah.
There's no impermissibility of donating a heart or a lung in Islam.
Sorry?
So there's no impermissibility in the context of donating a specific organ. Like this organ you cannot donate regardless of your school of thought or something on the lines of that. All organs are open in that sense.
Well, this needs looking into. So, and the idea behind that is that we need, this is where first, once we've got above the idea of whether organ transplantation is permissible or not, which is still a debate, it's an ongoing debate and will probably continue for the next 20, 30 years. But generally speaking, the next discussion would be which organs can we donate? And you'll find that there are certain fiqh academies that have already given you a list of all those organs which can. In living donors, but in dead donors, the same issue arises. And in dead donors, we need to look at how much of a necessity it is in the area that you're living in or the region that you're living in terms of the need for that particular organ. And also looking at the end outcome in terms of a good end result. So there's a number of different factors which were explained in the presentation earlier on. So we need to look at the figures. And this is an important point because it just goes to show the serious need to have a multidisciplinary team to sit down with ulama to discuss this. It's not something that one particular individual can go off, write a fatwa, no matter how recognize that individual is in his ability to research, that individual requires a number of specialists around him to give him clear detail on deciding which particular organs are in real need and that we should be, or we could donate.
So did I understand you correctly when you said that the organ should be used for the same purpose that that was created? So
I use the word, I use the word jins, which means the same genus of purpose. So which basically means that, for example, I was discussing this with somebody earlier on. He was saying that, so for example, could I use, let's say there's a kidney, and hypothetically speaking, not that it will ever be used, some lining of the kidney is being used as a ventricle for the heart or something along those lines. It falls within the same jins. So on that basis, yes, it can be used as to replace another organ, okay, or something along those lines.
So in terms of necessity, would you say that it's permissible to donate bone tissue or skin tissue when that will be used, as a skin graft? Not a dire situation for the recipient. Also bone, like for orthopedic purposes, is also not dire. So that...
Yeah. I mean, things like, for example, which are clearly, there is probably less invasiveness. Okay, that's one of, these are some of the principles that you need to really think about. So the issue regarding blood transfusion, for example, there's minimal invasiveness in giving a blood transfusion. For that reason, ulama are really okay with this idea, but only where there's a need. Okay. Then when it comes to issues such as bone marrow, okay, again, same kind of issue arises there. But when you're looking at issues, for example, the kidney, so a higher threshold is required, okay, because there's a greater risk relative to the others.
In case of deceased donation, what I meant is that we understood that it's permissible to donate a heart, a kidney, but how about donating skin, donating bone tissue? Right, cornea. Cornea, the necessity is more obvious, but when it comes to donating bone tissue, the recipients, their life does not depend on receiving that bone tissue. So I'm trying to clarify this idea of objectification, because there's a threshold, right, when it's a matter of objectification and when it's not.
It's based, because now you're applying the rule of necessity. Okay, so for that reason, so you've already gone over the threshold of necessity now. Okay, then the next question arises: how much of a necessity? Okay, and then you need to have the right kind of data to make that decision. Okay, and that's an answer I can't give you right now, but you need the right kind of data. That's why it's important that it has to be a disciplinary focus on deciding on that. And one thing that is very important here is that in different regions of the world, that may be different. Yeah? And the other issue is the idea of exploitation. So there are certain stipulated conditions for you to apply the idea of necessity. But if you look at the concept of ahwan al-sharrayn, so basically the easier steps of the harms, in terms of the lesser harm. So on that basis, if you're going to a country like a developing country, where clearly there's an issue of exploitation. Somebody was telling me about there are certain villages in Pakistan, for example, where if you look at the adult population, about 60% or 70% of them, they have a scar here. So and there's an element of exploitation going on. There's one agent who makes all the money, and these individuals are basically getting so much. So there, the idea of necessity would be completely, it would be reviewed in a very serious way and not applied. Yeah, it's a lot more complex than people make it out to be, and there are some clear stipulated conditions to apply that ruling.
Okay, we're going to do 2 more questions and end a little early. I have Asma here and Huwaida.
In terms of the concepts that you were talking about brain death and volition and when it's acceptable, death has started as a process and it's okay either to remove organs or whatever. I think that's very different from the perception on the ground. I don't know how it is in the UK, but clinically, or maybe it's mostly when we get ethics consults, but 95% of the Muslim families that they, and other families as well that they call consults on, it's people are either brain dead, not even talking vegetative state, but their answer is, I can't withdraw anything because I can't make that decision. That's Allah's decision. And and then they'll call their Shaykh or they'll call their Imam, and they'll say, no, you're killing that person if you agree to withdraw anything, and you can't ever withdraw anything. I mean, this is what you get. So how can we, like, where can we refer people? How can we begin these discussions? Like, what is a process that we can practically use to try to educate families on the ground that, you know, there's a difference between what they're understanding in a base level and versus maybe what the higher level scholars have been discussing, because it's just not getting filtered down to the bedside.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Informed decision making is really, really important. And you'll be surprised how many people have all sorts of, you know, unusual ideas about. I mean, there's even some idea of, you know, basically there's a controversy in terms of people are quite suspicious, you know, that doctors, you know, they just want organs, yeah, for organ transplantation. And no way, brain death has just been used as a means to just get organs, yeah? And they will use that sort of understanding. So, yeah, clearly there's a need for education. And that education has to be really delivered by trustworthy Muslim organizations, yeah? So number one, you need an organization that's earned the trust of the community. For it to do that requires that it needs to be representative of that community, okay? And the second is that they need to deliver it in a language that the people understand. But yeah, I think it's important. It needs to be done. Yeah. Yeah.
My question is, what's the level of harm that can be tolerated for a living donor?
Yeah.
So what's the, if it reaches, like this morning, a 5 to 10 times increased risk of end-stage renal failure, is that tolerable from a Muslim philosophical, legal perspective? If not, what's the level?
Okay. If you want me to give you a figure, I can't, okay? But what I can do, how we should look at this whole idea is we need to look at and measure the level of need or the level of necessity first. So let's say, for example, diabetes has reached a serious height in the Muslim community, okay? And we are now finding that a very large percentage of that community are ending up with end-stage kidney failure, okay? And a large percentage of them are now undergoing hemodialysis. Now, that is quite a serious situation. So on that basis, it needs to be measured up in terms of the level of harm we're willing to take for on the basis of the donor, okay? But at the same time, that harm should not be to the degree that it causes any issues with the functionality of that individual's day-to-day sort of living. So in other words, if it's compromising that individual in any way in terms of their functionality, so that individual is what we would considered as sick. That's a very arbitrary term and fluffy term to use, but generally speaking, you know, then at that stage you would think, no, that's not acceptable. You cannot harm another on that basis. You cannot harm another individual. And the question of how defining what harm is, clearly there needs to be a bit of work on that. What does that actually mean? But from my understanding on this particular subject, harm is described as was described on the definition related to durura, necessity, and that was in terms of functionality. So if your functionality is compromised as a result of you donating an organ, then that would not be acceptable. What that means as a percentage is something that we need to discuss. But you're looking at percentage, which suggests that a certain percentage is being harmed. Okay? Now, how much are you able to tolerate? A difficult question. It really needs to be looked at from that perspective. It cannot be a level which would make us feel uncomfortable, but what would make us feel uncomfortable?
Because on a population level, if you're saying that, if you're on a population level, if you start to permit it, and you get maybe a 1% increased risk of, or not just risk, of 1% more prevalence of, or incidence of kidney failure. If every 100 people you're getting one more person who's getting.
Yeah. Goes back to the whole point that at one end, you're seeing people dying or having a seriously low quality of life. At the other end, there's this potential way of dealing with the issue, right? And that is to up the, the sliding scale in terms of how much harm you're willing to accept. And that balance has to be made. And that balance would have to be made through a clear consensus of ulama, with having the right kind of individuals around them of different backgrounds, speciality. Look at the socio-demographical issues, the sort of health. It has to be a multi sort of, there needs to be people of many, many different backgrounds to sit there and discuss that. And then the ulama on a consensus would have to make that decision.
I was going to close, but you have comments, sir. Okay, so it's 5:15. I want to thank you all for participating in what was for at least I hope for 2.5 days of intellectual fodder for you to go home and think about. As I mentioned to you, that I don't expect you to have gained all the knowledge, but we've given you some references. I'm sure that the ulama and the fuqaha, you can look them up and find them as well to continue the conversation. I have 2 notes to make, and then you can kind of accost them if you want for a little while, but recognize they've been here and they're tired, and they need to leave as well. There's that post-knowledge survey that we talked about, right? So if you can now complete that and return that before you leave. There was a request made, if you can please bear with us for 15 minutes. Some of you, Rosie's going to take you in a little circle and talk to you and ask you if you understand this question. What do you think this means? And if you understand what it means, then we move forward. It shouldn't take very long. But if the wording is wrong, then we're going to ask the wrong question. So if you can participate in that, willing to participate in that, she begs of your assistance with that. I want to acknowledge and thank again not only Shaykh Amin and Dr. Shaykh Rafaqat, but Shaheen, Rosie, Brittany, our staff who was video recording this, the Chicago Muslim Medical Association, Templeton Foundation for the days that came before this. All the ulama and fuqaha have now hopefully landed back home where they left from, for putting on what I think was actually, for me, I'm just trying to curate and cultivate. But I think without any of them, none of this would happen. So please make dua for them, and at least in the spirit of gratitude. If you do leave and you do see them, show them or tell them your appreciation for what they did. Jazakallah khairan. And the one last request, please do remain connected and make dua for us and our society. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.